They say the Emperor protects. But when the sky splits open and living ships blot out the sun, when your homeworld's oceans turn the color of blood and the air tastes like rotting meat, you learn a harder truth. Protection is a luxury measured in parsecs, and your planet was simply too far, too insignificant, or too unlucky to matter. The Tyranids do not conquer. They do not occupy. They consume. And what remains after their feeding is not a corpse, but an absence. A planet stripped to bedrock. An ecosystem reduced to sterile dust. A billion lives converted into fuel for the swarm's endless hunger. I know this because I watched it happen. My name was Operative Calix Ven, assigned to the agri-world of Graia's Hope as a biological surveyor. I documented crop yields, monitored soil composition, tracked migration patterns of pollinator insects across the southern continent. Mundane work, peaceful work, the kind that makes a life forgettable in the best possible way. Then the shadow fell across our world, and I became the last human witness to an extinction so thorough that even memory would be devoured. The first indication came not from the void, but from beneath our feet. 3 months before the Hive fleet's arrival, the seismic monitors registered anomalies across 14 different continental plates. Minor tremors, irregular but persistent, concentrated in areas with no geological history of instability. The Adeptus Mechanicus team stationed at the Northern Research Outpost attributed the readings to equipment malfunction. When I suggested biological activity, subterranean organisms disturbing the crust, they dismissed the possibility with barely concealed contempt. Graia's Hope had been surveyed, cataloged, and exploited for 6 centuries. Every native species was documented, categorized, rendered harmless or extinct as circumstances required. The idea that something unknown could exist beneath our carefully managed ecosystems struck them as professional incompetence rather than legitimate concern. I persisted because the data patterns troubled me. The tremors followed migration corridors of the continent's primary grazing species, massive 6-legged herbivores we designated bovitors for their resemblance to Terran cattle. Every 72 hours, when the herds moved from one feeding ground to another, the seismic activity intensified. Not random geological shifts, but targeted responses synchronized with living movement above. I filed 3 separate reports with the Planetary Governor's Office. All were marked observed and archived without action. The 4th report, written after I discovered the first dead bovitor, never reached official channels, because by then the communications grid was failing. The creature had been an adult bull, 8 tons of muscle and bone, torn open from sternum to pelvis. The wound was not the work of predators. Graia's Hope hosted no carnivores at larger than 60 kilograms, all carefully maintained within population limits to prevent agricultural disruption. This had been precise, almost surgical. The ribcage spread wide and every internal organ removed. Not eaten. Removed. The carcass lay in the center of a perfectly circular area where all vegetation had died overnight. The grass and flowers reduced to gray sludge that released bubbles of foul-smelling gas when disturbed. I collected samples with hands that shook despite my training. The decay was wrong, accelerated beyond any natural decomposition, and the chemical composition of the slime suggested enzymatic breakdown of a kind I'd never encountered. 3 days later, the first spores fell from a clear blue sky. They drifted down like snow at first, pale and delicate, settling on rooftops and fields with apparent harmlessness. Children ran outside to catch them, laughing as the strange flakes melted on their tongues. Within the hour, Every child who'd made contact was convulsing in the streets, their bodies rejecting the foreign biological matter with violent immune responses that the planet's hospitals were catastrophically unprepared to treat. I watched from the survey station as the city below descended into chaos. Emergency services overwhelmed within minutes, medical supplies exhausted treating symptoms we couldn't identify from organisms we couldn't classify. The spores continued falling, thickening the air until sunlight dimmed to a sickly orange haze. My instruments detected complex organic compounds in the atmospheric samples, proteins, enzymes, and genetic material that defied categorization. Not plant, not fungus, not bacterial. Something that existed in categories Imperial biology had never needed to define. The planetary governor declared quarantine too late to matter. Ships attempting to flee the orbital docks reported engine failures as something grew across their hull plating, fusing airlocks shut and penetrating ventilation systems. The Vox channels filled with screaming that cut off abruptly, one vessel after another going silent until the space above Graia's Hope was a graveyard of trapped crews slowly suffocating in ships that had become tombs. I stood at my observation post and understood with perfect clarity that we would receive no rescue. The Imperium moved at the speed of bureaucracy even when worlds burned, and our distress signals would take months to reach ears that might care. By then, there would be nothing left to save. The spore fall continued for 6 days without pause. The accumulation on horizontal surfaces reached depths of 30 centimeters, drifts that shifted and moved with unsettling purpose whenever disturbed. I sealed the survey station's air filtration systems and watched through reinforced viewports as the world outside transformed. The carefully maintained forests that produced Graia's Hope's primary export, a hardwood prized across the sector for ship construction, began to dissolve. The trees didn't burn or topple. They zigzagged, bark running like wax, wood fibers separating and flowing downward into spreading pools of organic sludge that steamed in the orange half-light. They emerged from the slime pools on the 7th day. Small at first, no larger than the vermin we'd considered nuisances. Dog-sized creatures with too many legs and mandibles that clicked with mechanical precision. I observed them through the station's long-range optics, documenting their behavior with the same methodical attention I'd once devoted to pollinator populations. Foolish, perhaps, to maintain scientific detachment when witnessing apocalypse, but the training ran too deep to abandon even as the world ended. The creatures, I would later learn their designation as Ripper swarms, moved with coordinated purpose that suggested hive intelligence beyond individual consciousness. They didn't simply consume the biomass. They sorted it, separating organic compounds into distinct streams that flowed toward collection points where larger organisms waited. These secondary forms stood twice the height of a man, hunched and armored, with specialized limbs that scooped the processed material into internal cavities that glowed with bioluminescent activity. Living factories, digesting and refining the planet's substance into forms that served purposes I could only guess at. The human population's attempts at resistance were documented by surveillance systems that continued functioning even after the operators fled or died. I accessed the feeds from my station, watching grainy footage of PDF regiments deploying against the swarms. Last fire illuminated the twilight as soldiers poured firepower into the advancing masses. Individual creatures fell, their carapaces cracking under sustained fire. But for every one that died, 10 more surged forward. The swarms flowed around obstacles, exploited gaps in defensive lines, overwhelmed positions through sheer mass rather than tactical sophistication. What struck me most was the silence. The creatures produced no war cries, no sounds of aggression or pain. They simply moved forward with the inevitability of a rising tide, and when they reached the human defenders, the feeding began. I watched a man torn apart by a dozen small mandibles working in perfect coordination, each bite removing exactly enough tissue to keep him conscious and screaming for the 30 seconds it took to reduce him to components. The creatures didn't eat in any recognizable sense. They disassembled, broke down, processed. The soldier's bones were carried away separately from his organs, his blood siphoned into specialized organisms that pulsed as they moved, his flesh dissolved in digestive acids and absorbed into the ground where it would feed the growing biomass. The city fell in 3 hours. Not destroyed, absorbed. The buildings remained standing, but everything that had been alive disappeared into the mechanisms of consumption that now carpeted every surface. I survived the initial phases because the survey station had been built to withstand Graia's Hope's occasional severe weather events. Reinforced construction, independent power generation, sealed environment systems designed for prolonged isolation. It became my bunker, my observation post, my prison. The communications array remained functional long enough to receive one final transmission from off-world before the relay satellites were pulled from orbit by tendrils of organic matter that grew into space itself like grasping fingers. The message was fragmentary, corrupted by interference, but the essential content was clear enough. Hive fleet Jormungandr had been identified approaching the sector. All Imperial forces were withdrawing to defensible positions. Graia's Hope was classified as lost. Recommended action was immediate evacuation for essential personnel. The timestamp indicated the message had been transmitted 4 days after the spore fall began. 4 days after evacuation had become impossible. The Imperium's protection, such as it was, had arrived as a notification of our abandonment. I tried to respond, to confirm that someone still lived on this dying world, but the transmission systems were already failing. Something had infiltrated the power conduits, growing through the electrical systems like crystalline structures that pulsed with stolen energy. I shut down everything non-essential, retreating to the station's core laboratory, where emergency lighting cast red shadows across equipment that would never serve its intended purpose again. That night, if night could exist beneath the spore shroud that turned day and night into gradients of the same orange darkness, I heard them at the walls. Not scratching or pounding, but something worse. A sound like wet clay being shaped by invisible hands, like stone melting and reforming. The Ripper swarms had found the station, and they were testing its integrity with patient, methodical attention. I watched through the external cameras as thousands of small bodies pressed against the reinforced walls, secreting acids that ate through molecular bonds, creating microscopic weaknesses that accumulated with each application. They would breach the station eventually. The timeline was irrelevant. Hours or days made no difference when the outcome was predetermined. I considered ending myself quickly, denying the swarm the satisfaction of processing me alive. But curiosity proved stronger than fear, and perhaps that's the real human flaw. We need to know, even when knowing brings only horror. It arrived with the dawn of the 3rd week, though I only recognized dawn by my chronometer rather than any visible change in the perpetual gloom outside. The creature was massive, easily the size of the cargo haulers that had once transported Graia's Hope's timber exports to the orbital docks. It moved on 4 legs, thick as foundation pillars, its body hunched beneath armor plating that gleamed wetly in the bioluminescent glow of the smaller organisms that swarmed around it. But the legs and armor were secondary details compared to the mouth, if mouth was even the correct term for the massive cavity that dominated its front half. The opening was lined with concentric rings of teeth, each ring rotating independently, creating a grinding mechanism that I watched reduce a 3-story administrative building to rubble in less than 10 minutes. But even that description fails to capture the true horror, because the teeth weren't simply crushing the structure. They were sorting it, separating organic material from inorganic, living tissue from processed wood, metal from stone. Everything that had been part of the building was categorized and directed into specialized internal chambers visible through translucent sections of the creature's hide. I watched through the station's optics as the Haru-Specs, I would find its designation later in fragmented Imperial records I accessed during my final days, processed the building and its contents. The workers who'd been trapped inside were extracted still living, held in some kind of stasis by specialized organisms that flowed from the larger creature's body. They weren't killed immediately. They were preserved, kept viable. Their bodies converted into nutrients, but their consciousness maintained for reasons I could only guess at. Perhaps the Tyranids needed the neural patterns, harvesting memories and knowledge along with flesh. Perhaps the suffering itself served some function in their incomprehensible biology. Or perhaps maintaining life for as long as possible simply maximized nutrient extraction. The implications crystallized in my mind with terrible clarity. The Tyranids weren't simply animals following instinct, nor were they an invasion force in any conventional military sense. They were a galaxy-spanning digestive system, and every organism from the smallest ripper to the vast bioships I'd glimpsed through breaks in the spore cover was a specialized cell in a single entity beyond human comprehension. Every world they consumed didn't feed individual creatures, but contributed to the collective mass, the endless hunger that drove them across the stars. Graia's hope wasn't being destroyed. It was being eaten, digested, absorbed. And the process was so efficient, so thorough, that within months, there would be no evidence we'd ever existed. The biological transformation of the planet accelerated with each passing day. From my increasingly isolated observation post, I documented changes that redefined my understanding of what life could become when purpose replaced diversity. The sludge pools that had initially appeared as byproducts of decomposition revealed themselves as deliberate construction. They weren't puddles, but foundations, bases from which towers of organic matter grew with disturbing speed. These structures, some reached hundreds of meters into the shrouded sky, pulsed with internal activity I could detect through thermal imaging. Fluids moved through them in complex patterns, circulating nutrients and chemical compounds with the efficiency of purpose-built industrial systems. Specialized organisms crawled across their surfaces, maintaining and modifying the structures according to some blueprint I couldn't perceive. The towers connected to each other through thick cables of living tissue that spanned distances of kilometers, creating a web that encompassed the entire continent. I realized I was watching the construction of a planetary nervous system. The Tyranids weren't simply harvesting Graia's hope's biomass. They were incorporating the world itself into their collective consciousness. Every structure, every flowing cable, every smaller organism maintaining the network was a neuron in a brain the size of a planet, thinking thoughts no human could comprehend. The implications terrified me more than the death I knew was approaching. It suggested intention beyond simple feeding, purpose beyond mere consumption. The Hive mind wasn't just hungry. It was building something, transforming Graia's hope into a node in some vast calculation that spanned across stars and centuries. Our world would become part of the Tyrannid consciousness, every molecule of its substance incorporated into the endless evolution of the swarm. The survey station's power reserves dropped below 50%. I'd shut down all non-essential systems, but the environmental controls and life support couldn't be disabled without immediate death. The walls groaned under constant pressure from the organisms outside, and hairline cracks appeared in the reinforced viewports, despite their rated strength. I had days at most before the breach became catastrophic. It came for me on the 33rd day of the invasion. I'd been monitoring the approach of something large through the seismic sensors, watching the vibration pattern move with deliberate slowness toward the station. The smaller organisms parted as it advanced, clearing a path through the biomass that now covered every surface outside. When it finally emerged into view of the external cameras, I understood that my death would not be the mindless consumption of the swarms. The creature stood on 4 legs like the heresies, but it was smaller, sleeker, built for precision rather than mass processing. Its carapace was darker, almost black, and covered in sensory organs that gleamed like compound eyes across every surface. But what drew my attention was the crest, a fan of articulated tendrils that extended from its skull, each one tipped with neural interfaces that sparked with bioelectric activity. This was a specialist organism, designed not for feeding, but for something more targeted. It approached the station's main entrance and stopped. The tendrils extended toward the sealed blast door, pressing against the metal with gentle precision. I felt, rather than heard, the hum of psychic pressure building in the air, a sensation like the moment before a lightning strike. The creature wasn't attacking the door's physical structure. It was interfacing with the station's systems directly, its biology interacting with our technology in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The door's lock mechanism clicked open, not forced or broken, unlocked. The creature had simply understood the system and commanded it to open, its alien intelligence translating human engineering into patterns its biology could manipulate. The barrier that had protected me for a month became irrelevant in the span of 3 heartbeats. I retreated to the laboratory's rear chamber, sealing the internal pressure doors behind me. Foolish gesture. If the creature could unlock one door, it could unlock them all, but instinct drove me to create barriers, to delay the inevitable for seconds that no longer mattered. I heard it moving through the station's corridors, its claws clicking against the metal floor with measured steps, not rushing, not hunting in any predatory sense, simply approaching with the patience of something that knew escape was impossible. The internal door unlocked, with the same casual ease as the first. The creature entered the laboratory and regarded me with organs I couldn't properly interpret. Not eyes, those would suggest vision in ranges I understood, but sensory systems that probably perceived my body as patterns of heat, electrical impulses, chemical signatures. It saw not the human calyx ven, but the collection of nutrients and information I represented. The tendrils extended toward me, and I couldn't force my body to move. Not from fear, but from something worse. A psychic pressure that locked my muscles and held me rigid as the neural interfaces made contact with my skin. The sensation was indescribable, like having thoughts pulled directly from my brain and examined by something that understood consciousness only as data to be cataloged. I felt the creature reading my memories, not through words or images, but by tasting the neural patterns that encoded them. It learned everything I'd witnessed, every stage of the invasion, every failed defense, every moment of horror I documented with scientific detachment. The information flowed from me involuntarily, extracted with the same efficiency that the smaller organisms applied to physical biomass. When it finished, the pressure released, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air my lungs had forgotten to process during the violation. The creature didn't kill me. It simply turned and left, its purpose fulfilled. I had been indexed, cataloged, processed, and now I was irrelevant. The Tyranids had harvested what they wanted from my consciousness, and my continued existence was a detail too minor to warrant additional attention. I remained in the laboratory for 3 more days, sustained by emergency rations and recycled water that tasted like despair. The external cameras showed me the completion of the planetary transformation. The biomass towers reached towards space itself, growing beyond the atmosphere into the void where the Hive fleet's bioships waited like bloated ticks, gorging on an open wound. Vast tentacles of organic matter connected planet to ship, creating a circulatory system that pumped Graia's Hope's converted substance upward, while drawing down more specialized organisms to accelerate the final phases. The oceans boiled away, their water extracted and converted into whatever compounds the swarm required. The continents themselves began to crack and crumble as the Tyranids mined deeper than surface biomass, reaching for the minerals and metals in the planetary crust. I watched mountains dissolve over the course of hours, their stone reduced to powder that flowed into collection pools where massive organisms I'd never seen before processed it into new forms. Every living thing that hadn't already been consumed was dragged toward the extraction points. The planet's final native creatures, things that had evolved in isolation for millions of years before humanity's arrival, were pulled from their hiding places and fed into the digestive machinery. Birds fell from the shrouded sky, their wings useless against the spores that clogged their lungs and rewrote their cellular structure mid-flight. Fish floated to the surfaces of boiling seas, their bodies already beginning the transformation into something that would serve the swarm. Insects, microorganisms, the bacteria in the soil. Nothing was too small to escape notice, nothing too insignificant to be spared. The air itself changed composition as the Tyranids extracted oxygen and replaced it with gases more suitable for their biology. My suit's atmosphere sensors screamed warnings about toxicity levels that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. The sky shifted from orange to a deep purple black, and the pressure dropped as the atmosphere was systematically harvested and pumped into the waiting bioships. I realized Graia's Hope would soon have no atmosphere at all. The Tyranids would strip it away entirely, leaving a lifeless rock tumbling through space, indistinguishable from the countless other dead worlds scattered across the galaxy. In a century, no evidence would remain that this planet had once sustained complex ecosystems, that billions of organisms had called it home, that human civilization had thrived here for 600 years. We would be forgotten, not through the passage of time, but through the Tyranids' perfect efficiency. They didn't leave ruins, didn't create graveyards or monuments to their conquest. They simply erased, converting existence into absence with biological mechanisms that made mockery of everything the Imperium claimed about humanity's dominion over the galaxy. The survey station's power failed on the 41st day. The emergency batteries had been drained by the constant strain of life support in an environment that had become actively hostile to human survival. I sat in darkness, breathing air that tasted like the inside of a grave, and waited for the end that had been inevitable since the first spores fell. The walls trembled constantly now, not from external pressure, but from the planetary restructuring occurring kilometers beneath my feet. The Tyranids had reached the mantle, were extracting minerals and metals from depths that should have been inaccessible to any biology I understood. Graia's hope was being hollowed out from within, its substance transferred upward through the biomass towers that had become the planet's new defining features. I activated my personal Vox recorder for what would be the final time. Spoke into the device with the last strength I could muster. Not for any hope of rescue or recovery. The signal would never reach beyond the spore shroud, and even if it did, no one would come to retrieve it. I spoke because silence felt like surrender, and maintaining some gesture of human defiance mattered in those final moments, even if the defiance was meaningless. I documented what I'd witnessed, described the stages of consumption in clinical terms, because emotion had burned away weeks ago. I explained the Tyranids' efficiency, their terrible purpose, the way they transformed worlds not through fire or weapons, but through biology so advanced it became indistinguishable from nightmare. I warned whoever might eventually hear this recording, if the device survived somehow, if someone found it in the sterile aftermath, that fighting the Tyranids with conventional warfare was futile. They adapted, evolved, incorporated every defense into their own genetic memory. The only way to stop them was to deny them biomass, to burn worlds before they could feed, to sacrifice everything in scorched earth retreats that preserved nothing but prevented the swarm from growing stronger. The Imperium understood this, I thought. That's why they'd abandoned us so quickly. Graia's hopes 6 billion citizens were acceptable losses compared to the cost of defending a world the Tyranids had already marked for consumption. The Vox recorder died mid-sentence, its power supply finally exhausted. I sat in absolute darkness and listened to the sounds of my own breathing grow labored as the air toxicity reached critical levels. My thoughts became fragmented, consciousness dissolving as oxygen deprivation advanced through predictable stages. I thought about the children who'd caught falling spores on their tongues, laughing before the convulsions started. I thought about the soldiers torn apart by patient mandibles, their bodies sorted into component materials. I thought about the forests melting, the mountains crumbling, the oceans boiling away into nothing. I thought about the fact that the Tyranids didn't hate us, didn't see us as enemies, or even as alive in any meaningful sense. We were simply nutrients arranged in forms they would convert into more useful arrangements. The final thought I remember having was wondering if consciousness persisted during digestion, if some fragment of awareness remained as the Tyranids broke down neural tissue and extracted whatever information human brains encoded in their structure. Would I know the moment my mind dissolved? Would I feel myself becoming part of something vast and alien? Or would there simply be nothing, the cessation of thought as clean and final as a light being extinguished? The darkness deepened. The air turned thick and sweet with spores that had finally penetrated the station's failing seals. I felt something moving across my skin. Small organisms, exploring, testing, beginning the preliminary stages of conversion. My body tried to respond, to fight the intrusion, but the commands from brain to muscle traveled through pathways that were already being rewired for new purposes. I tried to scream and managed only a wet, gurgling sound as my throat sealed itself, the tissues reforming according to patterns the Tyranids encoded in every spore they released. My vision, what little remained in the absolute blackness, filled with phosphorescent lights that might have been hallucination, or might have been the bioluminescence of organisms colonizing my optical nerves. The last sensation I processed as something resembling human consciousness was not pain, but a horrible tingling that spread from my skin inward, reaching organs that spasmed once and then fell still as their functions were co-opted by the biomass that now filled the station, the continent, the planet. I became part of the consumption, a tiny component in the vast digestive mechanism that had once been a living world. 73 days after the first spores fell, Hive fleet Jormungandr departed the system. The bioships were bloated with biomass, their holds full of converted nutrients that would sustain the fleet's journey to the next feeding ground. Behind them, they left a world that no longer met the minimum criteria for planetary classification. The atmosphere was gone, stripped away entirely. The oceans had vanished, their molecular components broken down and incorporated into the swarm's biology. The continents, what remained of them, were cracked and hollow, vast cave systems where there had once been solid rock. Even the planet's core had been partially extracted, its metals and rare elements harvested with the same thorough efficiency applied to every other resource. No buildings remained standing. No evidence of human habitation survived, except for the faintest chemical traces in the sterile dust that covered everything. The cities where millions had lived, the farmlands that had sustained them, the forests that had seemed permanent features of the landscape, all gone, converted, absorbed. The survey station was a hollow shell, its walls still standing, but its interior scoured clean of anything organic. No bodies lay within, because bodies implied material that hadn't been fully utilized, and the Tyranids wasted nothing. The equipment remained, metal and plastics the swarm had determined weren't worth the energy expenditure of conversion. But everything that had been alive, the operators, the contamination in the air filters, the bacteria in the water recyclers, even the cells that had sloughed off human skin and settled as microscopic dust, was gone. A single Vox recorder lay in the station's central laboratory, its casing cracked, its power supply exhausted, its data storage intact, but encrypted with Imperial codes that would require specialized equipment to access. It contained the last testimony of Operative Calix Ven, biological surveyor, final witness to a world's consumption. The recording would never be recovered, because no Imperial forces would return to this system. The cost of investigating every dead world the Tyranids left in their wake would bankrupt the Imperium within a generation. Graia's Hope joined the archives as a single-line notation. Planet designated Graia's Hope, Segmentum Tempestus, Grid 847 Alpha. Status: consumed. Estimated loss: 6.2 billion Imperial citizens. Strategic value: none. Recommended action: none. File closed. The statistical summary didn't mention the children, the soldiers, the forests, or the oceans. It didn't describe the stages of consumption, the biological horror of watching an entire biosphere dissolve into nutrient streams. It certainly didn't acknowledge the failure of protection, the abandonment disguised as tactical necessity, the mathematical truth that some worlds were simply too expensive to defend. The Imperium moved on because the Imperium always moved on, a bureaucratic juggernaut too vast to stop or mourn or question its own calculations. 1 billion worlds paid tithes to maintain humanity's survival, and the loss of one agricultural world barely registered against the vast accounting of galactic empire. New colonies would be founded, new populations would be pressed into service, new worlds would produce the resources Graia's Hope could no longer provide. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, Hive fleet Jormungandr traveled toward the next feeding ground, its bioships gorged with biomass, but still hungry, always hungry, driven by imperatives no human could understand to consume and evolve and spread across the galaxy like a living extinction event. The Great Devourer had no memory of Graia's hope beyond the genetic information encoded in its vast biological libraries, the patterns and adaptations gleaned from processing an entire world's worth of life. It didn't remember the people, the civilizations, the ecosystems. It simply moved forward, following chemical gradients across the void that led it toward concentrations of biomass, toward worlds that shone with the light of living things, waiting to be converted into something more useful. In the cold mathematics of Tyranid existence, Graia's hope was a success. Maximum biomass extraction, minimal energy expenditure, complete conversion of all available resources. The planet had served its purpose in feeding the swarm, and now it was irrelevant, a sterile rock tumbling through space that would never again sustain life of any kind. The horror wasn't the consumption itself, but the efficiency, the perfection of a system that left nothing behind, that transformed existence into absence with such thorough precision that even memory became a casualty. The Tyranids didn't just kill worlds, they erased them, removed them from the galaxy's living present, and condemned them to a past so thoroughly digested that it became indistinguishable from never having existed at all. The records of Graia's hope conclude with coordinates of a dead world and casualty figures that fail to capture what was actually lost. The Tyranids didn't conquer a planet. They solved it, broke it down into base components, and reassembled those components into extensions of their own biology. Every stage of the consumption was purposeful, every organism specialized, every transformation serving the swarm's incomprehensible objectives. What remains after writing this account is not wisdom or hope, but a more precise understanding of the threat the Tyranids represent. They cannot be reasoned with because they possess no consciousness that would recognize reason. They cannot be deterred because they experience no fear of consequences. They cannot be starved because they carry their sustenance with them in the form of previously consumed worlds. The Imperium's only defense is the same brutal calculus the Tyranids themselves employ. Sacrifice what cannot be held, deny resources through destruction, maintain defensive perimeters at costs measured in entire populations. Mercy becomes a luxury, compassion a liability, and the Emperor's protection reveals itself as nothing more than triage on a galactic scale. Some worlds will be defended, others will be abandoned. The determination is made in distant offices by people who will never see the spores fall, or hear the screaming as human bodies are systematically disassembled. The decision is tactical, strategic, necessary. It is also a quiet acknowledgement that the Imperium cannot protect everyone, that some citizens will be fed to the darkness to buy time for others. I wrote this account because someone should know what happened to Graia's hope, what happens to every world that falls into the Tyranid's shadow. Not the statistical summary or strategic assessment, but the lived experience of extinction, the progressive horror of watching everything familiar dissolve into alien biology. Someone should remember that 6 billion people died here, not as martyrs or heroes, but as nutrients, their lives reduced to chemical compounds that now fuel the swarm's expansion across the galaxy. The Emperor protects. But protection has limits measured in astronomical units and political calculations. And when those limits are reached, when the cost of defense exceeds the value of what's being defended, the protection withdraws to more viable positions. What remains behind learns the oldest lesson in the galaxy's cruel education, that survival is not a right, but a circumstance, temporary and contingent, ending the moment something hungrier notices you exist. Graia's hope is gone. The people are gone. The forests, the oceans, the mountains, the carefully maintained ecosystems that sustained them, all gone, transformed into the biological mechanisms of an entity that will forget this meal before it finishes digesting. That's the true horror of the Tyranids, not the violence of their consumption, but the indifference, the absolute lack of malice or meaning in their feeding. They are not evil. They are simply hungry. And in a galaxy where hunger has evolved into a force of nature, spanning light years and millennia, being consumed is not tragedy, but inevitability. The only question that matters is whether your world will be the one that buys time for others, or the one that's sacrificed to give distant planets a few more years of ignorant peace. Graia's hope answered that question. Its citizens never knew they were part of a calculation, a tactical decision made before the spores even fell. Their world was abandoned, not because it couldn't be defended, but because defending it would cost more than letting it die. That knowledge changes nothing. The Tyranids continue their advance, world by world. Feeding by feeding, growing stronger with each successful consumption. And the Imperium continues its retreat, falling back to more defensible positions, sacrificing the periphery to maintain the core, making cold decisions that doom billions to buy time measured in decades. The cycle continues because it must, because the alternatives are extinction or transformation into something no longer recognizably human. The Emperor protects, but the protection comes with a price, and sometimes that price is paid in worlds reduced to sterile rock and populations converted into fuel for the galaxy's most efficient predator. Remember Graia's hope. Remember what the silence means when your astropathic communications go unanswered, when supply ships fail to arrive, when the sky begins to darken with falling spores. The silence means you've been calculated, assessed, and found wanting. The silence means you're alone. The silence means the consumption has already begun, and screaming into the void changes nothing, because the void is already full of creatures that hear your terror and interpret it as nothing more than the distress signals of nutrients awaiting conversion. That's the reality of being consumed by the Tyranids. Not a battle or an invasion, but digestion. Systematic, efficient, and absolutely thorough. Your world won't be conquered. It will be eaten. And when the feeding is complete, nothing will remain to prove you ever existed, except perhaps a single-line notation in archives no one will ever read, recording your extinction with the same clinical detachment you might apply to expired ration supplies. The Great Devourer approaches. It has always been approaching. It will always be approaching until every world is consumed and the galaxy falls silent, transformed into biological mechanisms serving purposes no human will ever understand. That future may be centuries away or millennia, but it advances with each world fed to the swarm, each population converted, each ecosystem absorbed. And somewhere in the ruins of what was once Graia's hope, a Vox recorder contains the final testimony of someone who watched it happen, who documented the stages of extinction with failing equipment and fading consciousness. The recording will never be recovered. The testimony will never be heard. But it exists, a ghost of human defiance preserved in encrypted data storage on a dead world, waiting in the darkness for someone who will never come. The Emperor protects, until he doesn't. And then you learn what it means to be truly alone in a galaxy that's hungry.